have to go to Europe and therefore take into account a European context. In Europe in the 1960s was undergoing massive political transformation and social transformation. And universities, particularly public universities, were extremely affected by this and the so-called student movement. In Denmark, this movement was very strong in Copenhagen, and radical students, particularly left-wing students from Copenhagen University, had taken to occupying people's offices, the rector's offices, and those kinds of things, demanding change. And at the same time, you had a demographic pressure on the university, which meant that there were simply not enough university places in Copenhagen, and the government was very keen to expand the number of university seats it could offer. Now, the Social Democrats had been very keen to first open a university in Aalborg and then consider other universities, but because Copenhagen was so overloaded with students, they decided to open the newest university in Roskilde, which is 30 kilometers outside of Copenhagen first. Now, this had very important consequences because it was close enough to Copenhagen that it could not escape the influence of Copenhagen, which was a good and a bad thing for the university. It was a good thing in that, swept in by the student revolution, they were able to get a momentum to really change the way pedagogy was being done. So, because of the influence of their founding rector, a social democrat called Erling Olsen, and also because of the influence of a very strong movement, which I will not try to pronounce in Danish, but is abbreviated as DSF, the Student Union.
Yep.
Those two movements, combination of Social Democrats and the DSF, were able to push through a reform that challenged the disciplinary nature of higher education. And this led to the construction of a new concept called basic education. And basic education was interdisciplinary in the sense that the students at Roskilde would be confronted for 2 years with a program that was broadly labeled as either humanities, social sciences, or natural sciences for 2 whole years. And originally, the first idea was that they would have no courses at all. No, not mandatory anyway. That the whole program would be run on the basis of projects that were both problem-oriented and participant-directed. Participant-directed was meant to show that the teacher and the students were included on an equal level in the project and that the both of them would contribute to the development of the project. And the problem orientation was meant to be a way to reframe the thinking about education. And you can't really understand problem education unless you understand the critical pedagogy movement. This was a movement that came out from Germany, and at the time was led by a philosopher who is still alive today called Oscar Necht. And this movement was brought into Denmark by the DSF, or at least some members of the DSF. There is ample evidence historically to show that actually very few members of the DSF truly understood what this movement stood for. But one of the things it did stand for was called in Danish fagkritik, please excuse me if I don't pronounce it correctly, but the critique of disciplines. The critique of disciplines is based on a Marxist critique of bourgeois higher education that posited that higher education had been overtaken by jargon, by words and vocabulary that only an elite could understand, and that was so materially different from the life experience of the working class that the working class were by default excluded from higher education. So it's strange in a sense that a theory that was developed for the emancipation of workers ended up in the hands of, well, upper middle class and middle class students, as most of the students who joined Roskilde at that time were. And what happened at that time is that because Roskilde was so close to Copenhagen, a lot of the students who were attracted to these kinds of ideals ended up going to Roskilde. and those who were not attracted by those kinds of ideas stayed in Copenhagen. So you had a university which was then ideologically driven, and very much left of left ideologically driven, to the point where even the Social Democrats were driven out of Roskilde University, and Erling Olsen, the rector, resigned, or was outed, it depends who you ask, and started criticizing his own university for being too radically Marxist. And this appeared in the press and was quite a cause of concern at the time, to the point where in 1977 Parliament held a vote whether to close the university and turn it into a motel or keep it open. And they were rescued by one vote of a Conservative Party member who voted against his own party to keep it open. However, they had to accept a compromise of a, let's say, external rectorate. A rectorate that was appointed not by the university and its board, but by the government. And that pretty much was the end of Fagkritik as a movement, and it reinstated disciplines as the primary entry point into higher education. So maybe you had a salvation of what was called multidisciplinarity, but true interdisciplinarity was never developed to its full potential.